Chapter 1. A child of Uganda to understand the man who would one day rule Uganda with an iron fist, it is necessary to look back at the quiet and modest beginnings of Idi Amin Dada. His story did not start in the halls of power, nor in the opulent palaces he would later occupy, but in the rural and changing landscape of colonial East Africa during the early decades of the 20th century. The world into which Amin was born was shaped by the sweeping changes of British colonial administration, traditional tribal structures, and a complex social hierarchy that divided people by region, ethnicity, and background. Born around the year 1925, though the exact date and year of his birth remain a subject of historical debate and uncertainty, Amin entered a society undergoing profound transformation. Idi Amin's family background was humble and rooted in the diverse cultural fabric of the region. His father, Andreas Nyabayer, belonged to the Kakwa ethnic group, a community traditionally situated near the borders connecting modern-day Uganda, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. His mother, Asa Otten, belonged to the Lugbara people. The Kakwa and Lugbara people inhabited the northwestern corner of Uganda, a region often referred to by colonial administrators as the West Nile District. This area was geographically and culturally distinct from the more politically dominant and economically developed southern regions of the country, such as Uganda. Growing up in the West Nile region meant that Amin experienced a childhood far removed from the centers of colonial governance and formal education. Family life during Amin's early years was marked by instability. His parents separated when he was quite young, leaving his mother to take primary responsibility for his upbringing. Asa Otten was a woman of traditional means, and some historical accounts suggest she had connections to traditional healing and herbalism, which was common in rural communities of the era. Following the separation, Amin moved with his mother through various locations in the West Nile region before eventually settling near Lugazi, a town situated in the Biokwe district of the central region of Uganda, closer to the sugar plantations and the economic hubs of the south. This relocation exposed the young Amin to a wider variety of cultures and peoples, moving him away from the isolated hills of his birthplace into an environment buzzing with migrant workers, colonial enterprise, and diverse languages. Education in the life of the young Idi Amin was brief and limited. During the British colonial period, formal Western education was largely dependent on mission schools run by Christian missionaries, as the colonial government left much of the primary education system in the hands of religious organizations. Amin attended a Roman Catholic mission school in Biokwe for a short period, where he learned rudimentary reading and writing skills in Swahili and basic English. However, his formal schooling did not last long. Due to a combination of economic hardship, family disruption, and perhaps a lack of academic inclination, Amin left school before completing any significant level of education. Unlike many of the nationalist leaders and intellectuals who would later emerge to challenge colonial rule, men who studied at prestigious institutions like Makara University or traveled abroad for higher education, Amin grew up with minimal formal literacy. Throughout his life, his command of English remained basic, and he relied heavily on his physical presence, charisma, and innate cunning rather than intellectual pursuits. Despite the lack of formal education, the social environment of colonial Uganda played a crucial role in shaping Amin's worldview. The British colonial administration utilized a system of indirect rule, often favoring certain ethnic groups for administrative and economic advantages while marginalizing others. The peoples of the northern regions, including the Kakwa and Acholi, were frequently viewed by the British as physically robust and well-suited for military and police service. Conversely, groups from the southern regions were often favored for clerical and administrative roles. This colonial strategy of dividing communities based on ethnic stereotypes created deep-seated regional and tribal rivalries that would plague Uganda for decades. As a young man, Amin grew up against the backdrop of these rising tensions. He witnessed firsthand the dominance of British colonial authorities and the rigid social stratification that dictated where people could live, work, and travel. Standing well over 6 feet tall and possessing an imposing physical stature, Amin was noticed early on for his strength and athletic abilities. He participated in local sports, particularly rugby and boxing, where his physical power made him a formidable competitor. These sporting arenas provided a rare space where young men from different backgrounds could interact, and Amin developed a reputation as a fierce and competitive individual. The social environment of Uganda in the 1930s and 1940s was also beginning to stir with the early murmurs of change. Although the push for full independence was still years away, ordinary Ugandans were increasingly affected by the economic demands of the British Empire, particularly during and after the Second World War. Crops were grown for export, labor was mobilized, and soldiers were recruited to serve in British military campaigns across Africa and beyond. For a young man like Amin, who possessed limited economic prospects and little formal education, the colonial military presented one of the few viable pathways for advancement, stability, and a steady livelihood. Thus, the formative years of Idi Amin laid the foundation for the complex and contradictory personality that would later emerge on the national stage. Raised in a fractured family, moving between the distinct cultures of the Northwest and the central sugar-growing regions, and experiencing the rigid hierarchies of colonial rule, he learned to navigate a harsh and competitive world through physical resilience and street smarts. He was a product of the margins of colonial society, a place where formal education was scarce, but survival demanded toughness and adaptability. The boy who left school early with little more than his physical strength and a rudimentary grasp of languages would soon step into the uniform of the British colonial army, beginning a military career that would eventually lead him to the highest echelons of power in Uganda, with catastrophic consequences for the nation. As the turbulent and uncertain years of his youth began to give way to the practical necessities of early adulthood, Idi Amin found himself standing at a major crossroads. The options available to a young man of his background, possessing little formal education and hailing from the marginalized West Nile region of colonial Uganda, were extremely limited. The local economy offered few opportunities for genuine advancement, and traditional agricultural labor held little appeal for someone of Amin's physical energy and ambition. It was against this backdrop of limited prospects and restless energy that Amin looked toward the institution that would completely transform his life, provide him with structure, and ultimately launch him on a pathway to absolute power: the British colonial military. During the middle years of the 20th century, the British Empire relied heavily on local military recruitment across its African territories to maintain colonial order, secure borders, and supply manpower for regional and global conflicts. In Uganda, the primary military force was the King's African Rifles, commonly known as the KAR. The KAR was a multi-battalion British colonial regiment consisting of troops recruited from various East African territories, including Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, and Nyasaland. British military strategy in the region was heavily influenced by colonial racial and ethnic stereotypes, which frequently categorized different indigenous groups according to perceived traits. Following a long-standing military tradition, British administrators and officers often preferred recruits from northern ethnic groups, such as the Kakwa, Lugbara, Acholi, and Langi, believing them to be physically superior, more resilient, and better suited for military discipline and combat than their southern counterparts. For Idi Amin, this colonial preference worked directly to his advantage. Standing well over 6 feet 3 inches tall and possessing an exceptionally powerful, athletic physique, Amin caught the immediate attention of recruiters when he decided to enlist. Historical records indicate that Amin entered military service around 1946, initially joining the British colonial forces as a humble assistant or support worker, before officially being accepted into the King's African Rifles. For a young man who had grown up moving through disrupted family environments and performing odd jobs around the sugar plantations of the central region, entering the military provided an immediate sense of stability, reliable shelter, regular meals, and a steady income. More importantly, it offered an institutional framework that valued physical strength, obedience, endurance, and toughness, qualities that Amin possessed in abundance. The transition from civilian life to the rigorous daily routine of the King's African Rifles was demanding. British officers maintained strict discipline, enforcing rigid military protocols, parade ground drills, and physical conditioning standards derived from traditional British military doctrine. Recruits were subjected to grueling physical training regimens designed to mold diverse individuals into an efficient and obedient fighting force. For Amin, whose formal education was minimal, and who struggled with complex written tasks, the physical and practical nature of military training suited his capabilities. He excelled in athletic competitions organized within the barracks, dominating in sports such as boxing, rugby, and track and field. His prowess in the boxing ring was particularly notable. For several successive years, Amin held the heavyweight boxing championship title within the military ranks, a feat that brought him considerable recognition among both his fellow soldiers and his British commanding officers. Within the barracks of the King's African Rifles, Amin's physical presence and athletic achievements helped him stand out, but his rise through the ranks was also driven by a sharp, pragmatic understanding of military hierarchy. He learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of the colonial army, where African soldiers served under white British officers while simultaneously interacting with comrades from various tribes and regions across East Africa. Amin quickly developed a reputation as a capable, physically imposing soldier who carried out orders without hesitation. In an environment where initiative was often viewed through the lens of strict obedience, his willingness to perform his duties aggressively and reliably caught the eye of his superiors. The broader historical context of the post-Second World War era meant that the King's African Rifles were not merely ceremonial garrison troops. They were actively deployed to handle security operations and imperial interests across the African continent and beyond. While Amin was building his early military career, British colonial forces were involved in various security actions, counterinsurgency operations, and peacekeeping missions. Although detailed records of Amin's earliest deployments remain sparse, historical evidence indicates that his battalion was involved in operations related to internal security and colonial administration during the late 1940s and early 1950s. One of the most significant early conflicts in which units of the King's African Rifles participated during this period was the Mau Mau uprising in neighboring Kenya, which began in the early 1950s. The Mau Mau Rebellion was an anti-colonial revolt primarily led by the Kikuyu people against British colonial rule in Kenya. The British administration deployed substantial military resources, including multiple battalions of the King's African Rifles from Uganda and Tanganyika, to suppress the uprising. Serving in Kenya during the height of the emergency exposed Amin to active counterinsurgency warfare, harsh field conditions, and the brutal realities of colonial suppression. Military service in these campaigns required absolute loyalty to the colonial chain of command, and Amin demonstrated a ruthless efficiency that impressed his British commanders. He earned a reputation as a tough, fearless soldier who did not hesitate to use force when ordered to do so. These experiences in the field reinforced his belief in the efficacy of violence and authoritarian control as methods for maintaining order and achieving objectives. As Amin spent years moving through the lower non-commissioned ranks, his military development was also shaped by the informal social networks within the barracks. He cultivated relationships with fellow Northern soldiers, building alliances and loyalties that would later form the bedrock of his personal power base. At the same time, he learned how to interact with British officers, adopting certain aspects of British military etiquette while maintaining the street-smart cunning that had helped him survive his youth. His rise from an uneducated, impoverished recruit to a respected and feared non-commissioned officer in the King's African Rifles demonstrated his remarkable adaptability within the colonial structure. However, the colonial military system in which Amin served was inherently paternalistic and discriminatory. Despite their combat experience and leadership capabilities, African soldiers were strictly limited in how far they could rise within the officer corps. The highest leadership positions, command structures, and strategic planning roles were exclusively reserved for white British officers. African personnel could achieve high non-commissioned ranks, such as sergeant or warrant officer, but the glass ceiling preventing them from commissioning as officers remained firmly in place throughout the late colonial period. This systemic limitation fostered a complex mix of resentment and ambition among African soldiers who watched foreign officers control their military destiny even as they performed the heavy lifting of empire defense. For Amin, this period of service in the King's African Rifles was much more than a routine employment. It was the crucible in which his entire worldview was forged. The military taught him that power flowed from the barrel of a gun, that loyalty could be commanded through strength and fear, and that institutional structures could be manipulated by those who understood how to navigate them. He absorbed the methods of colonial administration and military discipline, watching how a small group of officers could control a massive population through a combination of organization, intimidation, and strategic deployment of force. These lessons would remain deeply ingrained in his mind as Uganda inched closer toward the fateful precipice of national independence. By the mid-1950s, Idi Amin had established himself as one of the most prominent non-commissioned officers in the Ugandan battalions of the King's African Rifles. His physical imposingness, combined with his combat record in Kenya and his status as a champion military athlete, made him a well-known figure within the colonial military establishment. Yet, the horizon was shifting rapidly. The winds of decolonization were beginning to sweep across the African continent, and the British Empire was slowly preparing to relinquish direct control over its East African possessions. As political leaders in Uganda began organizing nationalist movements and demanding self-governance, the colonial military, the very institution that had shaped Idi Amin, was about to become the most critical instrument of political destiny in the emerging nation. The soldier who had entered the barracks seeking nothing more than a stable livelihood was now perfectly positioned to ride the impending wave of military and political transformation straight to the summit of power. As the 1950s advanced and the winds of political change began to sweep across the African continent, Uganda stood on the brink of a profound historical transformation. The British colonial administration, facing rising demands for self-determination and national sovereignty from local political leaders, started laying the groundwork for a transition toward independence. For the institutions that had sustained colonial rule for decades, this impending shift meant that old certainties were rapidly dissolving. Within the military barracks of the King's African Rifles, where Idi Amin had spent the previous decade establishing his reputation as a formidable and disciplined soldier, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and uncertainty. African soldiers and non-commissioned officers, long accustomed to answering exclusively to British commanders, began to realize that the future of the armed forces would soon intersect directly with the political destiny of a newly independent Uganda. During this critical transitional period, Idi Amin emerged as an increasingly prominent figure within the military establishment. His rise was not the result of formal education or high-level academic training, but rather the product of his exceptional physical presence, his unwavering adherence to military routine, and a sharp, opportunistic awareness of the shifting power dynamics around him. As a senior non-commissioned officer, Amin commanded respect through his sheer physical authority and his athletic dominance. His ongoing success in military boxing championships and athletic competitions kept his name familiar not only to the ordinary troops under his observation, but also to the British officers who relied on dependable, physically imposing NCOs to maintain discipline and morale among the native battalions. However, the responsibilities and expectations placed upon soldiers of Amin's rank were expanding well beyond standard garrison duties and routine parade ground exercises. As nationalist political movements gained momentum throughout Uganda, organizing rallies, demanding constitutional reforms, and calling for the end of colonial rule, the British administration found itself increasingly reliant on the military to police internal security. Protests, labor strikes, and civil unrest became more frequent in various parts of the protectorate. Units of the King's African Rifles were frequently deployed to maintain public order, guard vital infrastructure, and suppress political disturbances. In these sensitive operations, Idi Amin proved to be a reliable instrument for the colonial authorities, carrying out commands without hesitation and demonstrating a firm, uncompromising approach to crowd control and security enforcement. While Amin was solidifying his position as a tough and trusted sergeant within the ranks, Uganda's broader political landscape was undergoing a complex evolution. Early nationalist leaders, representing diverse regional, ethnic, and religious interests, began forming political parties to negotiate with the British government for a timetable toward independence. Figures representing traditional kingdoms, particularly the powerful Kingdom of Uganda, as well as leaders from the northern and eastern regions, began to vie for influence over the future government of the country. This political mosaic was fragile and fragmented, characterized by deep divisions and rivalries that would eventually pose significant challenges to national unity. Yet, amidst these political maneuvers, many civilian leaders recognized early on that whoever controlled the military would ultimately hold the decisive leverage in the post-independent state. It was during this period of growing political awareness that Amin began to cultivate relationships that extended beyond the immediate boundaries of the military barracks. Although British colonial officers maintained a strict policy discouraging active political partisanship among native troops, military personnel were keenly aware of the politicians who visited army camps or sought informal alliances with influential soldiers. Amin, with his street-smart intuition and practical cunning, understood that the traditional balance of power was shifting. He began to position himself as a key connector among northern soldiers, building a solid base of loyalty and camaraderie that transcended simple regimental bonds. His fellow northern recruits, particularly those from the West Nile region, viewed Amin as a strong and protective senior figure who understood their background and shared their ambitions for advancement. British commanding officers viewed Amin with a mixture of pragmatic approval and cautious distance. On one hand, they appreciated his effectiveness, his physical endurance, and his total obedience to the chain of command during operations. His ability to keep his men in line and execute orders efficiently made him an invaluable asset during a time of widespread administrative stress. On the other hand, some British officers recognized that Amin lacked the broader intellectual perspective and diplomatic finesse required for high-level leadership in a modern nation-state. Nevertheless, the immediate demands of maintaining colonial security outweighed long-term concerns, and Amin continued to receive promotions and commendations that elevated his status within the military hierarchy. As the decade drew toward a close, the preparations for Uganda's independence accelerated. The British government announced plans for constitutional conferences and scheduled elections that would pave the way for self-rule. For the King's African Rifles, this meant that the inevitable process of Africanization, the replacement of British officers with native commanders, was rapidly approaching. This impending transition created a mixture of excitement and anxiety among African soldiers. For years, they had lived under a strict colonial hierarchy where the glass ceiling prevented them from reaching the officer corps. Now, the prospect of commanding their own national army opened up extraordinary horizons of ambition. Idi Amin stood at the center of this monumental shift. Although he was not yet an officer, his prominence as a senior non-commissioned warrant officer placed him in a unique position to influence the rank and file. He watched closely as civilian politicians maneuvered for power, noting their weaknesses, their reliance on ethnic alliances, and their growing dependence on the security forces to enforce their authority. He observed how political leaders sought the backing of military figures to secure their own positions against political rivals. These observations provided Amin with an invaluable education in realpolitik, teaching him that political authority in a fragile new state did not rely merely on popular support or parliamentary majorities, but on the control of disciplined armed force. Amin's growing visibility also began to attract the attention of the emerging political elite. Leaders who were positioning themselves to take the reins of government recognized that having powerful military figures on their side, or at least ensuring their neutrality, was essential for political survival. Amin's approachable yet imposing demeanor, combined with his reputation as a fearless soldier who could manage difficult situations without flinching, made him a figure of considerable interest to politicians looking to build back-channel relationships with the armed forces. He was no longer just an ordinary soldier from a marginalized background. He was becoming a recognized national figure whose influence within the military apparatus could sway the balance of power. The final years leading up to Ugandan independence were thus marked by a subtle but intense competition for influence within the armed forces. The soldiers who had served the British Empire across East Africa were now preparing to become the guardians of a sovereign nation, yet they carried with them the authoritarian habits, ethnic divisions, and hierarchical models learned under colonial rule. Idi Amin navigated this transitional environment with remarkable skill, using his athletic renown, his military record, and his growing network of loyal followers to cement his status as a rising star within the forces. As the countdown to independence ticked away, the stage was fully set for the military to step out of the shadows of colonialism and assume a dominant and ultimately decisive role in Uganda's political future. The ambitious soldier from West Nile was now poised on the very threshold of national power, ready to seize whatever opportunities the future might present. As the dawn of October 9, 1962, approached, the flags of the United Kingdom were lowered across Uganda, and the vibrant black, yellow, and red banner of the newly independent nation was raised in their place. After decades of British colonial rule, the sovereign state of Uganda was born. The transition was greeted with nationwide celebrations, street dances, and hopeful speeches delivered by the country's new political leadership. Yet beneath the surface of public jubilation lay a fragile political structure, held together by uneasy compromises and competing regional interests. At the head of this newly independent government stood Prime Minister Milton Obote, a sharp and politically astute leader from the Northern Territories. Alongside him, other prominent politicians vied for influence, representing traditional kingdoms and diverse ethnic communities. For the ordinary citizens of Uganda, independence promised a future of self-determination, economic growth, and national unity. But for the military establishment, and for ambitious soldiers like Idi Amin, the birth of the nation marked the opening of an entirely new arena for power, ambition, and political maneuvering. The departure of British administrative oversight left a profound vacuum within the state institutions, most notably within the armed forces. The newly renamed Uganda Rifles, formerly the King's African Rifles, faced the immediate and urgent task of Africanization. For years, the upper echelons of military leadership, from company commanders to the highest-ranking generals, had been exclusively British. Now, native African soldiers were stepping into these roles, assuming responsibilities that they had previously only observed from afar. This process was filled with tension. While qualified, educated officers were desperately needed to lead the national army, the rapid promotion of personnel often depended as much on political loyalty, ethnic background, and personal connections as it did on formal military competence. Idi Amin watched these sweeping changes with intense interest, recognizing that the restructuring of the military was the single most important development in the country's early years of freedom. Idi Amin's own position within the military underwent a significant elevation during this transitional phase. His years of loyal service under the British, combined with his formidable physical presence and his strong standing among northern troops, made him an indispensable figure as the armed forces reorganized. He was commissioned as an officer, crossing the crucial boundary from a senior non-commissioned warrant officer into the corps of military leadership. This promotion was not merely a reward for past service, it was a pragmatic necessity for the political leadership. Prime Minister Abbott and his inner circle quickly realized that maintaining control over a newly formed nation required a reliable military force, and keeping influential soldiers like Amin satisfied and aligned with the government was essential for political survival. Amin was granted higher rank, greater responsibilities, and wider access to the circles where military and political decisions intersected. As an officer in the newly independent Uganda Army, Amin began to expand his sphere of influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of the barracks. He cultivated relationships with key government ministers, members of parliament, and civil servants. While Abbott focused on navigating the complex parliamentary politics of a multi-ethnic nation, Amin busied himself with building a solid power base within the ranks. He paid close attention to the recruitment of soldiers, ensuring that men from his own ethnic background and from the West Nile region found a welcoming environment within the armed forces. Over time, this deliberate demographic shaping of the military would create a distinct power imbalance, but in the early years of independence, it was viewed simply as a pragmatic effort by a senior commander to secure loyalty and maintain internal discipline among troops who were adjusting to the sudden departure of British officers. The relationship between Prime Minister Abbott and Idi Amin during these early post-independence years was defined by a complex mixture of mutual utility and underlying suspicion. Abbott, an intellectual and a civilian politician, recognized that Amin lacked formal education and sophistication, but he also understood that Amin possessed a dangerous, raw capability to command loyalty and manage the physical instruments of power. Amin, for his part, treated civilian politicians with an outward display of deference while quietly evaluating their weaknesses. He observed how fragile parliamentary coalitions were, how quickly political alliances could fracture, and how easily civil unrest could erupt in a society divided by regional and tribal rivalries. Through these observations, Amin learned a vital lesson that would shape his entire worldview. Political power in Uganda did not ultimately reside in legislative debates or constitutional documents, but in the hands of whoever commanded the loyalty of the armed soldiers stationed in the capital. This reality was brought into sharp focus as Uganda's early political honeymoon began to fade. Within a few short years of independence, the fragile coalition that had brought the country to self-rule started to crack. Tensions flared between the central government and the powerful traditional kingdoms, most notably the Kingdom of Uganda, whose leaders demanded a high degree of autonomy that clashed with Abbott's vision of a centralized nation-state. Political rivalries within the ruling party intensified, accusations of corruption began to circulate in the national press, and public dissatisfaction grew in various regions. As political opposition mounted, Prime Minister Abbott found himself relying more and more heavily on the security forces to suppress dissent, manage protests, and keep political rivals in check. The military, which should have remained a neutral guardian of the state constitution, was increasingly drawn into the turbulent arena of partisan politics. Idi Amin found himself right at the center of these escalating political tensions. Because of his senior rank and his reputation for decisive action, he was frequently called upon by the government to handle sensitive security assignments. Whether it involved monitoring restless populations, securing strategic locations, or managing restive units within the army, Amin executed his duties with a direct, uncompromising approach that earned him the quiet gratitude of the Prime Minister and the deep apprehension of political opponents. He understood that every crisis the government faced increased its dependence on the military, and every increase in military dependence elevated his own personal importance within the state hierarchy. He was no longer just a prominent soldier. He was becoming an indispensable pillar of the entire regime. Behind the scenes, Amin's personal lifestyle and public persona also began to evolve. With his higher officer rank came increased financial opportunities, social status, and visibility among Kampala's elite. He was a frequent guest at official functions, where his imposing physical stature, easy charm, and straightforward manner contrasted sharply with the polished, academic style of the civilian politicians. Yet, despite his outward geniality, Amin maintained a sharp, predatory awareness of the shifting political winds. He nurtured a network of loyal junior officers and enlisted men who looked up to him as a strong protector, creating a distinct faction within the armed forces that answered more directly to him than to the formal military command structure. As the 1960s progressed, the gap between the civilian government and the military apparatus narrowed dangerously. Uganda was transforming from a parliamentary democracy into a state where political survival depended on the backing of men with guns. Prime Minister Obote, sensing the potential threat posed by ambitious military commanders, attempted to balance his generals against one another, shifting commands and trying to assert tighter political control over the army. However, these maneuvers only served to heighten paranoia within the barracks. The officers who had tasted power and influence during the transition to independence were no longer content to remain subordinate to civilian politicians, whom they viewed as corrupt, indecisive, and disconnected from the realities of the country. Idi Amin navigated these delicate political maneuvers with the cunning of a seasoned survivor. He kept his ambitions carefully masked behind a facade of loyal obedience, convincing the political leadership that he was a reliable soldier focused solely on his military duties, while simultaneously strengthening his grip on the loyalty of the troops. He watched as the constitutional framework of the young nation began to fray under the pressure of political ambition, ethnic friction, and institutional decay. The stage was slowly being set for a major confrontation between the civilian authorities and the armed forces they had empowered. For Idi Amin, the ambitious soldier who had risen from humble beginnings in colonial Uganda, the journey from the barracks to the very precipice of supreme political power was nearing its critical turning point. The nation he had helped usher into independence was now drifting toward a profound crisis, and the ambitious general from West Nile was positioned to seize the ultimate prize when the fragile political order finally collapsed. By the dawn of 1971, the Republic of Uganda stood on the razor's edge of a profound political collapse. The fragile alliance that had guided the country through its early years of independence had completely shattered, replaced by a tense, suffocating atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. At the heart of this escalating crisis was the toxic relationship between Prime Minister Milton Obote and his army commander, Major General Idi Amin. For months, a silent, high-stakes struggle for supremacy had been unfolding behind closed doors. Obote, increasingly aware that his hold on the nation was slipping, attempted to consolidate his authority by bypassing traditional military chains of command, promoting officers loyal to his own ethnic faction, and launching investigations into alleged financial irregularities within the military establishment, particularly targeting funds handled by Amin. For Amin, these moves were not merely administrative audits, they were existential threats. He knew that if he did not strike first, he would soon be arrested, sidelined, or eliminated. The tension reached a boiling point in January 1971 while Prime Minister Abbott was out of the country, attending a Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference in Singapore. For an ambitious military commander who had spent years cultivating fierce loyalty among the rank and file, this absence presented an unrepeatable opportunity. Amin and his inner circle of trusted officers began quietly mobilizing key military units across the country. They knew that seizing control of a nation required absolute precision, swift execution, and the immediate neutralization of any armed resistance or loyalist forces stationed in the capital city of Kampala. The plot was hatched in secret, coordinated through trusted commanders who shared Amin's deep frustration with the civilian government and who stood to gain from a military takeover. Troops from the West Nile region, who formed the backbone of Amin's support within the armed forces, were quietly placed on high alert, waiting for the signal to move. In the dark hours of January 25, 1971, the quiet streets of Kampala were suddenly shattered by the thunderous roar of military trucks, armored personnel carriers, and heavy boots. Soldiers loyal to Idi Amin executed a textbook coup d'etat with astonishing speed and ruthless efficiency. Key strategic locations across the capital were surrounded and secured within a matter of hours. The Entebbe International Airport, the vital communications hub of the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, police headquarters, and all major road intersections leading into the city were locked down under heavy military guard. Resistance from loyalist security forces was minimal and quickly crushed. Caught entirely off guard by the coordination and scale of the mutiny, commanders faithful to Abbott found themselves isolated, cut off from communications, and unable to organize an effective counteroffensive. By sunrise, the capital was firmly under the control of the rebellious army units. As the morning light illuminated Kampala, the terrified and bewildered citizens of Uganda woke up to a transformed political reality. The national radio station, usually playing traditional morning music and government announcements, began broadcasting martial music interspersed with terse military bulletins. Soon, the voice of Major General Idi Amin himself echoed across the airwaves, announcing to a stunned nation that the government of Prime Minister Milton Abbott had been deposed. The broadcast declared that the armed forces had taken control to end corruption, mismanagement, and the creeping division of the country, promising that the military would soon return power to a civilian government once order was restored. Citizens cautiously stepped out onto their balconies and porches, listening to the crackle of transistor radios as they tried to comprehend the monumental shift that had taken place overnight without massive street battles, yet with absolute finality. The swift takeover marked a dramatic transformation in Idi Amin's personal destiny. Just days before, he had been a vulnerable military commander facing imminent disgrace and possible arrest by a suspicious civilian administration. Now, he stood at the absolute pinnacle of state power, having transformed himself from a senior military officer into the head of state and supreme commander of the armed forces. The transformation was swift, absolute, and intoxicating. Crowds of people, weary of years of political instability and economic hardship under Abbott, initially flooded the streets of Kampala to celebrate the fall of the old regime, some even cheering for Amin as a liberator who had rescued the nation from tyranny. Yet, beneath the festive atmosphere and the hopeful cheers of citizens seeking stability, a much darker and more dangerous era was quietly beginning. The ambitious soldier from West Nile had achieved his ultimate ambition. But in doing so, he had chained the fate of Uganda to the unpredictable whims, raw paranoia, and absolute authority of a military strongman. The morning after the coup, The atmosphere across Uganda was a complex mix of anxious uncertainty and cautious relief. Citizens walked the streets of Kampala with wary eyes, glancing at the soldiers stationed at street corners and checkpoints, yet many felt a quiet sense of liberation. For years, the government of Milton Obote had grown increasingly authoritarian, alienating traditional kingdoms, cracking down on political opposition, and plunging the nation into ethnic and regional friction. When Major General Idi Amin seized power on January 25, 1971, he recognized that his immediate survival and future legitimacy depended entirely on how the public and the international community perceived his initial actions. He needed to present himself not as a ruthless, power-hungry dictator, but as a benevolent soldier who had stepped in purely out of duty to save the country from ruin. To project this image of a stabilizing force, Amin moved quickly to dismantle the most hated symbols of Obote's repressive administration. Just days after taking control, he ordered the dismantling of the General Service Unit, Obote's feared intelligence agency that had operated above the law, terrorizing political dissidents and spying on ordinary citizens. Amin also announced the immediate release of dozens of political prisoners who had been detained without trial under Obote's emergency regulations. Among the freed prisoners were prominent politicians, journalists, and civic leaders who had languished in dark cells for months or even years. As these men and women walked out of detention facilities into the bright Ugandan sunlight, embraced by weeping families, the public relations victory for Amin was immense. Newspapers and international broadcasters picked up the stories, painting the new military leader as a reformer with a compassionate streak. Capitalizing on this early goodwill, Amin actively courted the support of traditional power brokers and regional leaders who had been marginalized by Obote. He made a symbolic gesture of profound national importance by arranging for the return of the body of Sir Edward Mutesa Roman II, the first president of Uganda and the exiled Kabaka, King of Buganda, who had died in London under mysterious circumstances after his palace was stormed by Obote's forces in 1966. Amin ordered a lavish, state-sponsored funeral with full military honors, allowing the Buganda people to properly mourn and bury their beloved monarch. This single act earned Amin massive popularity and deep gratitude throughout the populous Buganda region, effectively neutralizing potential resistance from the country's largest traditional ethnic group during his most vulnerable early weeks in power. Beyond domestic gestures, Amin sought to reassure the international community, particularly Britain and neighboring African states, that Uganda remained open for business and stable under military management. He met with foreign diplomats, promising that his administration would respect international agreements, protect foreign investments, and work cooperatively with regional partners. Western governments, eager for stability in East Africa and relieved to see the left-leaning policies of Obote pushed aside, offered cautious optimism and diplomatic recognition. British diplomats, in particular, viewed the towering, affable military officer with a sense of patronizing approval, mistakenly believing he would be an easily managed ally who would protect Western economic interests in the region. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of reform and the public displays of generosity, a profound structural change was taking place within the machinery of the state. Amin may have dismantled Obote's intelligence apparatus, but he immediately began constructing his own, far more personalized network of control. Power was rapidly concentrated within a tight circle of military officers, primarily drawn from Amin's own ethnic and regional groups in the West Nile province, such as the Kakwa and Nubian soldiers. Traditional civil servants and experienced government ministers found themselves sidelined as military decrees began overriding civilian laws. The cabinet was restructured to include a mix of technocrats and military personnel, but the real authority rested solely with the supreme commander in State House. As the weeks turned into months, a distinct cult of personality began to bloom around Idi Amin. Newspapers, state radio, and television broadcasts were filled with daily reports of the general's activities, portraying him as a tireless, hands-on leader who worked day and night for the welfare of the ordinary Ugandan. State-run media frequently broadcast footage of Amin visiting factories, playing sports with soldiers, dancing with traditional troops, and driving around Kampala in open-top vehicles to wave at adoring crowds. He projected an image of physical strength, larger-than-life charm, and populist appeal. Foreign journalists were invited to interview him, and Amin played the role of the unconventional, plain-speaking African soldier to perfection, often disarming interviewers with a booming laugh and spontaneous anecdotes. This carefully manufactured persona of the friendly giant began to mask a growing unpredictability within the administration. While Amin publicly claimed to despise corruption and inefficiency, his decisions increasingly relied on personal whim rather than structured governance. Ministers and senior officials learned quickly that contradicting the general or offering professional advice that conflicted with his sudden impulses could result in sudden dismissal or public humiliation. Cabinet meetings became less about collaborative policymaking and more about listening to monologues delivered by the commander-in-chief, who expected total agreement and unwavering loyalty. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, reveled in the initial economic breathing room that followed the coup. Price controls were adjusted, basic goods that had grown scarce under Obote reappeared in shops, and the heavy cloud of political paranoia that had dominated the late 1960s seemed to lift, replaced by a festive atmosphere of public celebration and national pride. People felt free to speak their minds in public markets and tea rooms without constantly looking over their shoulders for secret police informants. The general public wanted to believe in the promise of a fresh start, choosing to interpret Amin's eccentricities and booming presence as harmless quirks rather than warning signs of deeper instability. Yet, political analysts and senior civil servants who looked closer at the administration's inner workings began to feel a creeping sense of unease. The dismissal of experienced bureaucrats, the growing dominance of military officers in civilian ministries, and the absolute centralization of power in one man created a fragile house of cards. The state machinery was no longer governed by institutional checks and balances, but by the personal moods and shifting loyalties of a single individual whose education was rooted in military obedience rather than democratic governance. The seeds of future crisis were sown deep within these early months, as the initial euphoria of the coup slowly gave way to an environment where the nation's destiny was tied entirely to the unpredictable nature of its new strongman. The honeymoon period that followed the January 1971 coup was brief, fragile, and ultimately illusory. As the initial euphoria of liberation faded, the true nature of Idi Amin's military regime began to reveal itself in the most terrifying ways possible. What had started as a cautious hope for reform and stability quickly degenerated into a systematic reign of terror. General Amin, increasingly paranoid and intolerant of any form of dissent, shifted from utilizing political manipulation to employing absolute, unrestrained violence. Uganda was rapidly transformed into a police state where the rule of law was replaced by arbitrary decrees, and where fear became the primary instrument of governance. The machinery of repression under Amin was multifaceted, ruthlessly efficient, and designed to penetrate every level of Ugandan society. While the general had publicly dismantled Milton Obote's notorious General Service Unit during his first days in power, he immediately established his own far more brutal security apparatuses. Chief among these were the State Research Bureau and the Public Safety Unit. These organizations operated entirely outside the formal legal system, possessing sweeping powers to arrest, detain, interrogate, and eliminate anyone suspected of opposing the regime. Their operatives, often recruited from Amin's ethnic base in the West Nile province and granted total impunity, roamed the streets of Kampala and regional towns with absolute authority. The atmosphere of fear that spread throughout Uganda was pervasive and suffocating. Ordinary citizens quickly realized that a casual remark at a local market, a perceived slight against a military officer, or even an innocuous conversation in a public tea room could lead to a midnight knock on the door. People learned to censor themselves, whispering about politics behind closed doors and teaching their children never to repeat things heard at home. The concept of due process evaporated entirely. Habeas corpus ceased to exist, and families were left in agonizing suspense when loved ones vanished without a trace, often never to be seen or heard from again. Political purges became a regular feature of Amin's administration as his paranoia deepened. In the months following the coup, the military itself was subjected to intense scrutiny. Amin grew increasingly suspicious of soldiers and officers who belonged to ethnic groups associated with the previous government, particularly the Acholi and Lango troops who had formed the backbone of Obote's army. Tensions within the barracks boiled over into open violence as ethnic friction was exploited and weaponized by the regime. Reports of missing soldiers began to filter out of military camps, followed by wholesale massacres within military installations across the country. Officers who had initially helped Amin secure power found themselves sidelined, demoted, or targeted for elimination, as the dictator concentrated authority within an ever-shrinking circle of loyalists. The terror was not confined to the military. It systematically targeted the intellectual, professional, and political elite of Uganda. University professors, judges, journalists, religious leaders, and prominent businessmen were viewed by the regime as potential threats or centers of alternative influence. Makara University, once celebrated as one of the premier academic institutions in Africa, became a primary target for intellectual purging. Brilliant scholars, independent thinkers, and outspoken critics were systematically silenced through intimidation, arrest, or forced exile. Many chose to flee the country, creating a devastating brain drain that crippled Uganda's educational, medical, and administrative infrastructure. Religious leaders also found themselves in the crosshairs of Amin's unpredictable wrath. While the regime publicly maintained relations with religious institutions, independent voices within the clergy who dared to speak out against human rights abuses or moral corruption faced severe intimidation. The most prominent victim of this religious and political clash was Janani Luwum, the Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, whose courageous criticisms of the regime's brutality made him a moral beacon for the oppressed population. His sudden and violent death under officially disputed circumstances sent shockwaves around the globe, demonstrating that no one, regardless of spiritual standing or public prominence, was safe from the regime's murderous reach. The methods of elimination employed by Amin's security forces were designed to maximize psychological terror. Secret detention centers, interrogation chambers, and execution sites were established across the country, where prisoners were subjected to horrific tortures designed to extract confessions or information about alleged anti-government plots. Bodies were frequently dumped into rivers or remote rural areas, serving as grim warnings to anyone who might consider resisting the dictatorship. The state-controlled media maintained a chilling silence regarding these disappearances, creating a surreal parallel reality where the regime broadcast cheerful cultural events and sports achievements, while citizens whispered about the latest wave of terror. Internationally, reports of widespread human rights abuses began to pierce the wall of diplomatic isolation and secrecy that the regime attempted to maintain. Amnesty International, foreign journalists, and exiled Ugandan activists worked tirelessly to document the escalating atrocities, publishing harrowing accounts of arbitrary arrests, torture, and mass killings. Yet, despite mounting international condemnation, Amin remained defiant, brushing off criticism as Western propaganda and continuing his brutal consolidation of power. The international community found itself grappling with a tyrant who was as unpredictable on the global stage as he was merciless at home. Inside Uganda, the psychological toll of this unrelenting climate of fear was devastating. Society fractured along ethnic, tribal, and regional lines as neighbors grew suspicious of neighbors and traditional bonds of community trust were eroded by paranoia. People learned to survive by remaining invisible, keeping their heads down, and avoiding any association with political matters. The vibrant, optimistic spirit that had marked Uganda's independence and the initial days following the coup was thoroughly extinguished, replaced by a heavy, sorrowful endurance. The transformation of Uganda from a hopeful, developing East African nation into a feared police state was complete. Idi Amin had successfully established absolute control, but it was a control built entirely upon a foundation of blood, terror, and systematic repression. The machinery of violence he constructed would ultimately define his legacy, casting a long, dark shadow over the nation, and ensuring that his rule would be remembered not for its promises of reform, but for the profound and pervasive fear that defined daily life for millions of Ugandans. The consolidation of absolute political power and the destruction of domestic opposition did not satisfy Idi Amin's ambitions for reshaping Uganda. Having established a reign of terror that cowed the political, intellectual, and military elite, the dictator turned his attention toward the nation's economy and its minority populations. Among the most drastic, disruptive, and internationally scrutinized actions of Amin's entire rule was his sudden and total expulsion of Uganda's Asian community in 1972. This sweeping decree forever altered the demographic, cultural, and economic fabric of the country, plunging Uganda into a deep economic crisis while demonstrating to the world the unpredictable and destructive nature of the military regime. To understand the magnitude of the expulsion, it is necessary to examine the history of the Asian community in Uganda. People of South Asian descent, primarily originating from the Indian subcontinent, had lived and worked in East Africa for generations. Many had first arrived during the late 19th century under British colonial administration, brought over to help construct the Uganda Railway connecting the interior to the coast. Following the completion of the railway, many of these families chose to remain. Over the decades, they established deep roots in Ugandan towns and cities, building successful enterprises ranging from small retail shops and family-run duka businesses to large commercial trading houses, cotton gins, coffee processing plants, and manufacturing industries. By the time Uganda achieved independence in 1962, the Asian community occupied a distinct and vital position within the national economy. While they constituted a very small percentage of the total population, they dominated the commercial, retail, and professional sectors. They were prominent among merchants, bankers, doctors, lawyers, and accountants. However, this economic prominence existed alongside significant social segregation. Under British colonial rule, society had been rigidly stratified into European, Asian, and African tiers, which fostered mutual misunderstandings and latent social tensions. Following independence, although many Asians embraced Ugandan citizenship and sought to integrate into the newly independent nation, underlying resentments regarding economic disparities persisted among some segments of the indigenous population. Idi Amin recognized these latent tensions and masterfully weaponized them to serve his own political survival. As his regime faced mounting economic challenges, declining popularity among certain groups, and internal military friction, Amin needed a dramatic distraction, a scapegoat that could channel public frustration away from his own failures and unite the population behind a popular nationalist cause. He chose the Asian community, framing them not as fellow citizens or hardworking contributors to the national economy, but as foreign exploiters who had allegedly drained Uganda's wealth, practiced rampant corruption, and refused to fully integrate into Ugandan society. The defining moment came in August 1972, when Amin announced a decree that shocked the world. He claimed that God had spoken to him in a dream, instructing him to order the expulsion of all Asians who were citizens of the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. Shortly thereafter, the decree was expanded to include even those Asians who held Ugandan citizenship. They were given a terrifyingly brief ultimatum. They had exactly 90 days to pack up their belongings, liquidate their businesses, and leave the country. Overnight, tens of thousands of families whose lives, histories, and livelihoods were inextricably bound to Uganda were told they were no longer welcome. The announcement unleashed an immediate wave of panic, confusion, and despair throughout the Asian community. Families who had lived in East Africa for 3 generations found themselves targeted for collective punishment based solely on their ethnic origin. The 90-day countdown initiated a frantic, heartbreaking scramble to wind up affairs that had taken a lifetime to build. People rushed to sell their homes, cars, household goods, and business inventories, often receiving only a fraction of their true value from opportunistic buyers who sensed the desperation of the sellers. Long queues formed outside banks, government offices, and airline ticket counters as people sought the necessary documentation and transport to flee. Under the rules of the decree, departing Asians were subjected to severe financial restrictions. They were permitted to take only a minimal amount of luggage and a strictly limited sum of cash out of the country, effectively forcing them to abandon the vast majority of their accumulated wealth, property, and assets behind. The regime promised that businesses, homes, and enterprises would be inventoried and later redistributed to indigenous Ugandans, a populist policy that Amin termed the economic war. The practical execution of the expulsion was marked by bureaucratic chaos, official corruption, and widespread harassment. As the departure deadline approached in November 1972, Entebbe International Airport and the border crossings became scenes of immense human suffering. Departing residents faced humiliating inspections by military and security personnel at checkpoints, where remaining valuables, jewelry, and personal documents were frequently confiscated under the guise of enforcing the exit regulations. Families boarded planes with little more than the clothes they wore and handfuls of paperwork, leaving behind empty storefronts, silent warehouses, and decades of shared history. Internationally, the expulsion drew sharp, widespread condemnation. Governments around the world expressed outrage at the blatant racism and violation of human rights inherent in a mass deportation based on ethnicity. The United Kingdom, India, and various international bodies protested vigorously, while thousands of refugees sought asylum abroad. The UK accepted the largest number of British passport-holding Ugandan Asians, while others found homes in Canada, India, Pakistan, and various European nations. Despite the global outcry, Amin remained defiant. Basking in the domestic popularity, the move initially generated among certain segments of the population who cheered the sudden transfer of commercial wealth into African hands. However, the long-term consequences of the Asian expulsion for Uganda's economy were catastrophic. The sudden departure of thousands of experienced merchants, skilled technicians, professional managers, and entrepreneurial leaders dealt a crippling blow to the nation's infrastructure. The businesses, shops, and industries confiscated by the state were hastily distributed not to qualified professionals or experienced business owners, but to Amin's military favorites, political cronies, and supporters who lacked the necessary expertise, capital, or commercial networks to run them successfully. This redistribution process, ironically dubbed Bibinka, or the allocation of property, became a massive exercise in corruption and mismanagement. Military officers and political loyalists took over major trading houses, factories, and agricultural enterprises, often looting the remaining stock, selling off machinery for quick cash, and abandoning operations once the inventory was exhausted. Shelves in shops across Kampala and regional centers rapidly emptied. The intricate supply chains that kept goods flowing smoothly through the country broke down completely. Basic commodities such as sugar, salt, soap, flour, and fuel vanished from the markets, giving rise to rampant hoarding, severe shortages, and an explosive black market known locally as magendo. The agricultural sector, which relied heavily on commercial networks and processing plants formerly managed by Asians, suffered a precipitous decline. Coffee and cotton production dropped significantly, starving the government of essential foreign exchange earnings. Inflation skyrocketed, and the value of the Ugandan shilling plummeted, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary citizens and plunging the general population into severe economic hardship. The very policy that Amin had promised would bring economic independence and prosperity to Ugandans instead resulted in near-total economic collapse. Furthermore, the expulsion isolated Uganda further from the international community. Traditional trading partners reassessed their relationships with the regime, foreign investment dried up, and technical assistance programs were withdrawn. The country found itself increasingly reliant on improvised trade arrangements and short-term measures, as the economic foundation of the state eroded beneath the feet of the military government. In retrospect, the expulsion of the Asians stands as a pivotal turning point in Idi Amin's presidency. It showcased the regime's willingness to sacrifice national well-being for short-term political theater and demagoguery. While it temporarily consolidated Amin's domestic standing among some who welcomed the immediate seizure of foreign-owned wealth, it ultimately dismantled the productive core of Uganda's economy. The empty storefronts, ruined businesses, and widespread scarcity that followed left an indelible scar on the nation, proving that the regime's policies were driven not by sound economic strategy, but by arbitrary impulse, prejudice, and a reckless disregard for the future of Uganda. Having shattered Uganda's economy through the reckless expulsion of its commercial backbone and driven the nation into deepening isolation, Idi Amin turned his relentless focus toward cultivating a public persona that was as theatrical as it was terrifying. As his domestic policies failed and the international community recoiled from his brutal methods, the Ugandan dictator transformed himself into a global spectacle. No longer content with merely ruling through fear at home, Amin sought to capture the imagination of the world stage, blending bizarre pageantry, megalomaniacal titles, erratic diplomacy, and unpredictable behavior into a surreal public theater that fascinated and appalled observers across the globe. During the mid-1970s, Amin's public image underwent a dramatic and bizarre evolution. He began to shower himself with an ever-expanding array of self-bestowed military medals, decorations, and grandiose titles that grew increasingly absurd with each passing year. In 1976, he conferred upon himself the title of Life President of Uganda, cementing his absolute authority in law while casting aside any remaining pretense of constitutional governance. Shortly thereafter, he added to his formal styling a collection of titles that read like the script of a satirical play. He declared himself Field Marshal Dr. Idi Amin Dada, V.C., DSO, M.C., and Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas. Perhaps most notoriously, Amin proclaimed himself the conqueror of the British Empire, a title he used to mock Great Britain and assert his perceived dominance over his former colonial masters. He delighted in sending taunting, eccentric telegrams to world leaders, including Queen Elizabeth II and U.S. presidents, offering unsolicited advice on global affairs or teasing them about their political troubles. These public communications were often treated as dark comedy by the international press, but inside Uganda, they were deadly serious matters. To laugh at the dictator's jokes or question his titles was to invite immediate arrest, torture, or death. Amin's obsession with pageantry and his desire to project supreme power were vividly displayed in state ceremonies, parades, and public addresses. He frequently demanded that British expatriates living in Uganda carry him around on a ceremonial chair, mimicking the way local kings had once been transported, or that they kneel before him to pay homage. These humiliating spectacles were captured by state photographers and broadcast to the population as proof of his absolute supremacy over white Europeans. His public speeches, delivered in a mixture of broken English, Swahili, and Luganda, were rambling, emotional, and laced with threats against imaginary enemies, foreign spies, and domestic traitors. Despite the economic ruin surrounding him, Amin spared no expense when it came to his own personal comfort and grandiose displays. He maintained multiple presidential palaces, imported luxury goods aboard chartered aircraft, while ordinary Ugandans stood in endless queues for basic food items, and surrounded himself with a rotating cadre of loyal bodyguards and sycophantic advisors. His wardrobe shifted between immaculate, heavily decorated military dress uniforms, adorned with rows of colorful ribbons, and traditional Ugandan attire, all carefully chosen to project different facets of his manufactured persona to the public. Internationally, Amin's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. He frequently courted controversy through theatrical diplomatic maneuvers, shifting his geopolitical allegiances depending on which superpower or regional ally offered him the most financial or military backing. Initially maintaining cordial relations with Western nations and Israel, Amin later severed ties with Israel and forged close alliances with radical regimes and anti-Western leaders, most notably Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. He openly praised figures like Adolf Hitler for their treatment of minority groups, drawing fierce international condemnation while seemingly reveling in the shock value of his statements. The global media watched in a mixture of horror and fascination as the Ugandan president played out his eccentricities on the world stage. Satirical cartoonists, documentary filmmakers, and international journalists portrayed him as a cartoonish tyrant, a caricature of African dictatorship. Yet behind the absurd titles, the medals, and the bizarre diplomatic stunts lay a chilling reality. The international spectacle served as a smokescreen for the ongoing violence, disappearances, and systematic terror occurring daily within Uganda's borders. While the world laughed at his telegrams or shook its head at his latest outrageous public pronouncement, the citizens of Uganda lived under the constant shadow of a brutal and deeply unstable military ruler who brooked no dissent and demanded absolute worship. By the late 1970s, the Republic of Uganda was caught in the grip of a profound and sweeping crisis. What had begun as a military takeover promising national unity and economic reform had deteriorated into an era of profound instability, widespread fear, and economic ruin. The vibrant nation that had emerged from British colonial rule just over a decade prior was now buckling under the weight of mismanagement, corruption, and the relentless paranoia of its leader. Idi Amin's grip on power, though still maintained through absolute terror, was becoming increasingly fragile as the very foundations of the state began to crumble around him. The most immediate and visible manifestation of Uganda's crisis was the catastrophic collapse of its economy. Following the expulsion of the industrious Asian minority in 1972, the country's commercial, agricultural, and industrial sectors had suffered a devastating blow. Retail shops stood empty with shattered windows, once thriving factories ground to a halt due to a lack of skilled operators and spare parts, and agricultural exports plummeted. Essential goods such as sugar, salt, soap, flour, and cooking oil vanished from standard markets, replaced by a thriving underground black market known locally as Magendo. Ordinary Ugandans were forced to spend hours standing in endless queues outside government-regulated shops, often leaving empty-handed after enduring scorching sun or torrential downpours. Inflation soared to astronomical levels, rendering the local currency virtually worthless, while civil servants, teachers, and even military personnel went months without receiving their meager salaries. Corruption and economic looting became institutionalized under Amin's administration. The lucrative businesses, real estate, and properties confiscated from the departed Asian community had been distributed indiscriminately to Amin's inner circle, military favorites, and illiterate cronies as rewards for loyalty. Devoid of business acumen or administrative experience, the new owners quickly ran these enterprises into the ground, selling off machinery as scrap metal and pocketing short-term profits. Smuggling across porous borders became a major economic activity, enriching high-ranking military officers while depriving the national treasury of vital tax revenues. The state was effectively bankrupt, surviving only on foreign loans, ad hoc financial assistance from sympathetic foreign benefactors like Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, and the dwindling export revenues of coffee, which was harvested and smuggled under military supervision. As the economic situation worsened, the social fabric of Ugandan society frayed profoundly. Hospitals and medical clinics ran out of basic antibiotics, painkillers, and surgical supplies, leading to a resurgence of preventable diseases and a sharp decline in public health standards. Schools and universities suffered from severe shortages of textbooks, paper, and qualified teachers as many intellectuals, professionals, and academics fled the country into exile. The brain drain was catastrophic. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, and university professors escaped across borders into Kenya, Tanzania, or Europe, leaving Uganda desperately short of the expertise required to run a modern state. Those who remained lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, censoring their own words and avoiding public discussions of politics to protect themselves and their families. Within the military, which formed the bedrock of Amin's dictatorship, instability and distrust were mounting. Paranoid about potential coups and assassinations, Amin constantly reshuffled his military commanders, purged suspected rivals, and replaced experienced officers with members of his own ethnic group or loyal recruits from West Nile. This ethnic favoritism created deep fissures within the armed forces. Soldiers from other regions, particularly Acholi and Langi troops who had been associated with former President Milton Obote, felt increasingly threatened and marginalized. Mutinies, internal feuds, and violent clashes among different military factions broke out with increasing frequency behind closed doors, forcing Amin to rely on foreign mercenaries, specialized security units, and his notorious State Research Bureau to maintain order. Internationally, Uganda's isolation reached unprecedented levels. The regime's abysmal human rights record, documented by international human rights organizations and escaping refugees, drew universal condemnation from the global community. Traditional Western allies distanced themselves completely from Kampala, cutting off developmental aid and imposing diplomatic sanctions. Even neighboring African nations, which had initially observed the Organization of African Unity policy of non-interference in internal affairs, grew increasingly embarrassed and alarmed by Amin's erratic behavior and the regional destabilization caused by fleeing refugees and cross-border tensions. Uganda was viewed by many as a pariah state, friendless on the global stage except for a few radical regimes that offered tactical or financial support in exchange for anti-Western posturing. Yet, despite the mounting pressures, the declining standard of living, and the unmistakable signs of systemic collapse, Amin's regime did not moderate its behavior. Instead, the dictator doubled down on repression, utilizing violence and intimidation as his primary tools of governance. The security apparatus operated with absolute impunity, dragging suspected dissidents, striking workers, and critics from their homes in the dead of night. Prisons overflowed with political prisoners, and torture chambers continued their grim work beneath the capital city. The regime's survival was no longer predicated on popular support, economic prosperity, or administrative competence. It relied exclusively on brute force, fear, and the unyielding loyalty of heavily armed security forces. By the end of the decade, Uganda had reached a definitive tipping point. The country was exhausted, impoverished, and deeply fractured. The social contract between the state and its citizens had been entirely shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of survival and quiet desperation. Amin's regime was living on borrowed time, sustained only by the inertia of terror and the guns of his loyalist troops. The structural decay had gone too deep for superficial fixes, and the widening chasm between the ruling elite and the suffering populace guaranteed that a major reckoning was fast approaching. The economic ruin, military instability, and international isolation had set the stage for the final, violent chapter of Idi Amin's turbulent reign. As the 1970s drew toward a close, the mounting internal pressures, economic collapse, and widespread international isolation of Idi Amin's regime finally culminated in an open and catastrophic military confrontation. For years, neighboring Tanzania had absorbed tens of thousands of Ugandan political refugees, intellectuals, and exiled military officers who had fled the terror of Amin's government. Among these exiles, resistance groups began to organize, determined to overthrow the dictatorship and liberate their homeland. Relations between Uganda and Tanzania, which had been tense and hostile ever since Amin seized power in 1971 and ousted former President Milton Obote, a close friend of Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, were now at an absolute breaking point. The deep personal animosity between Amin and Nyerere, combined with persistent border skirmishes and ideological clashes, created a volatile powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came in late October 1978, when a mutiny within a section of the Ugandan army based in Masaka and Mbarara was brutally suppressed by loyalist troops. Seeking a scapegoat to divert attention from internal military fracturing and to rally a restless populace behind a wave of nationalist fervor, Idi Amin chose to manufacture an external crisis. Falsely claiming that Tanzanian forces had launched an unprovoked invasion of Ugandan territory, Amin ordered his army to cross the southern border and retaliate. On October 30, 1978, units of the Uganda Army invaded northern Tanzania, occupying a strategic strip of land known as the Kagera salient. The invading troops engaged in widespread looting, destruction, and terror against the local civilian population, annexing the region and declaring it formally incorporated into Uganda. President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, a respected statesman known for his quiet demeanor and firm adherence to anti-colonial principles, reacted with profound outrage. While Tanzania was a developing nation facing its own economic difficulties, Nyerere recognized that allowing an aggressive neighbor to annex sovereign Tanzanian territory with impunity represented an intolerable threat to national security and regional stability. Tanzania immediately mobilized its armed forces, the Tanzania People's Defense Force, TPDF, issuing a stern ultimatum for Ugandan forces to withdraw unconditionally. When Amin arrogantly dismissed the warning and celebrated the incursion as a military triumph, Tanzania prepared for full-scale war, calling up reservists and transforming its southern command into a powerful counteroffensive machine. To the utter shock and miscalculation of Idi Amin, the military campaign quickly turned against Uganda. The Uganda army, once feared for its ruthless internal efficiency and heavy weaponry, was deeply degraded by years of institutional corruption, systemic purges, lack of maintenance, and the flight of skilled technicians. Troops went unpaid for months, fuel and ammunition supplies were haphazardly managed, and high-ranking commanders were appointed based on ethnic loyalty rather than tactical competence. In stark contrast, the Tanzanian army was a disciplined, professional, and well-organized force. Bolstered by modern equipment, high morale, and a clear defensive mandate, the TPDF rapidly halted the Ugandan advance and pushed across the border back into Ugandan territory. As Tanzanian forces advanced northward into southern Uganda, the myth of Amin's invincible military machine evaporated with astonishing speed. Towns such as Mutukula and Masaka fell to the advancing TPDF columns after brief engagements. Rather than offering fierce resistance, Many demoralized Ugandan soldiers abandoned their heavy artillery, shed their uniforms, and fled in disarray, looting civilian property along the way. Amin scrambled desperately to salvage the situation, issuing bizarre radio broadcasts, boasting of his martial arts prowess, and demanding that international bodies intervene. Yet, his calls for assistance fell largely on deaf ears. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, one of Amin's few remaining allies, offered rhetorical support and eventually dispatched a contingent of Libyan troops and transport planes to assist the crumbling regime. But foreign intervention proved too little, too late to turn the tide. The tide of the war turned decisively when Ugandan exiles, who had spent years fractured by political rivalries, managed to unite under a single umbrella organization known as the Uganda National Liberation Front, UNLF. Alongside its military wing, the Tanzania National Liberation Army, TNLA. Hundreds of eager Ugandan volunteers crossed the border alongside Tanzanian troops, transforming what began as a border defense operation into a full-scale liberation war. As the combined forces advanced deeper into the country, local populations welcomed the advancing troops not as conquerors, but as liberators who had come to end 8 years of unspeakable nightmare. Civilians came out of hiding to cheer the advancing columns, providing vital logistical intelligence and pointing out hidden positions of loyalist forces. Idi Amin's regime responded to military defeat with frantic paranoia and characteristic brutality. As the front lines drew closer to the capital, secret police units stepped up arrests and executions of suspected collaborators in Kampala and surrounding districts, desperately trying to silence any internal dissent before it could manifest into an open uprising. However, the apparatus of terror was no longer capable of halting the collective momentum of the advancing liberation forces. Military barracks emptied out as commanders deserted their posts, and government ministries ground to a halt as officials packed their belongings and fled toward Amin's home region in the north. The once omnipotent dictatorship was disintegrating in real time, consumed by its own internal rot and the overwhelming force of the advancing Tanzanian and Exile armies. By early 1979, the conflict had reached the central heartland of Uganda. Strategic towns fell one by one, and the logistical supply lines of the Uganda army completely collapsed. Despite last-ditch efforts by Libyan expeditionary forces to mount a defensive line south of Kampala, the superior firepower and tactical coordination of the TPDF easily outflanked them. The final weeks of the war were characterized by chaotic retreats, panicked fleeing of government officials, and a growing sense of euphoric anticipation among the long-suffering citizens of Kampala. The 8-year reign of terror engineered by Idi Amin was reaching its absolute and inevitable twilight, leaving behind a ruined state, a fractured society, and a country bracing itself for the final, historic collapse of the dictatorship. The final weeks of Idi Amin's regime played out like a tragic and chaotic drama across the hills and streets of Kampala. By the spring of 1979, the inevitable collapse of the 8-year dictatorship was no longer a distant possibility. It was an unfolding reality happening hour by hour. The capital city, once a place where people whispered in fear and looked over their shoulders, was now gripped by a tense, electric atmosphere of panic and anticipation. Residents stayed indoors, listening anxiously to the distant, rolling thunder of heavy artillery drawing closer by the day. Rumors spread like wildfire through the neighborhoods. Some whispered that Amin had already fled the country, while others claimed his loyalist forces were preparing a desperate, bloody last stand within the city center. Inside the seat of government, the scene was one of utter disarray and surreal detachment. Idi Amin, who had long portrayed himself as an invincible conqueror, a field marshal of unmatched genius, and the lifeblood of Uganda, began to realize that his reign was slipping through his fingers. Reports from the Southern Front brought news of continuous defeats, desertions, and the rapid advance of the Tanzania People's Defense Force alongside the Ugandan exiles of the Uganda National Liberation Front. Yet, even as his ministers packed their suitcases in frantic haste and abandoned their offices, Amin continued to project an aura of defiance. He held erratic meetings with his remaining loyal commanders, broadcast rambling messages over state radio, and blamed foreign powers for his military misfortunes, refusing to accept that his own brutal policies and institutional destruction had brought his empire down. The logistical backbone of the government had completely shattered. Government ministries were empty husks, telephone lines were unreliable, and vehicles belonging to state departments were commandeered by fleeing officials desperate to escape northward toward Amin's home region of West Nile. In the commercial districts, shops were shuttered, markets stood abandoned, and the streets grew increasingly deserted as the sound of gunfire echoed from the southern outskirts. The feared State Research Bureau and military intelligence units, which had operated with absolute impunity for years, began burning sensitive documents in massive bonfires behind their headquarters, desperate to destroy evidence of their countless atrocities before the liberation forces arrived. On the southern approaches to Kampala, the final military engagements unfolded. Libyan expeditionary forces, hastily dispatched by Muammar Gaddafi to prop up his beleaguered ally, attempted to establish defensive positions and halt the advancing Tanzanian columns. However, the Libyan troops were unfamiliar with the terrain, poorly coordinated with the demoralized remnants of the Uganda army, and completely outmatched by the disciplined tactical maneuvers of the TPDF. After brief but intense skirmishes that sent shockwaves through the southern suburbs, the defense lines crumbled. Libyan soldiers retreated in disarray, joining the general exodus of Ugandan loyalists who were fleeing in every direction. The road to the capital lay wide open. On April 10, 1979, vanguard units of the Tanzanian army and the Ugandan Liberation Forces entered Kampala. There was no prolonged, destructive urban siege as many had feared. Instead, the entry was marked by the swift collapse of remaining government resistance. As the liberating columns rolled into the city center, an astonishing transformation took place. Thousands of citizens who had hidden indoors for days poured out onto the streets, spilling into the avenues, waving tree branches, cheering and weeping with profound relief. The long nightmare of arbitrary arrests, state-sponsored terror, economic scarcity, and pervasive fear was finally over. People embraced one another, danced in the dusty roads, and rushed to pull down symbols of the hated dictatorship, marking the absolute liberation of the capital. Amidst the jubilation and the chaotic celebration of freedom, the man who had ruled Uganda with an iron fist for nearly a decade made his dramatic exit. Realizing that all was lost, and that capture meant facing justice for the immense suffering inflicted upon the nation, Idi Amin staged a hurried departure. Accompanied by a small retinue of close family members and loyal guards, he boarded a presidential helicopter or vehicle convoy, making his way to Entebbe International Airport. From there, he managed to secure a flight out of the country, escaping into temporary safety in Libya before eventually settling into a long exile in Saudi Arabia. His hurried flight marked the abrupt and unceremonious end of one of the most brutal chapters in modern African history. The immediate aftermath of the capital's capture revealed both the profound joy of liberation and the heavy toll of 8 years of misrule. The city bore the physical scars of conflict, with abandoned military vehicles littering the roads, empty administrative buildings bearing the marks of hasty departures, and infrastructure severely degraded by years of neglect and corruption. Yet, the overriding sentiment among the populace was one of profound rebirth. As order slowly began to return under provisional leadership, Ugandan looked toward the future with cautious optimism, determined to rebuild their shattered society, honor the memory of those who had perished, and ensure that tyranny would never again take root in their homeland. Following his dramatic escape from Uganda in the spring of 1979, Idi Amin entered a strange and unexpected phase of his life: exile. The man who had once commanded absolute authority over millions strutted through military parades as a self-proclaimed field marshal, and ruled through unyielding terror was suddenly reduced to a stateless fugitive seeking sanctuary. His journey out of East Africa initially brought him to Libya, where his former benefactor, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, offered temporary shelter as a reward for past alliances. However, staying in Tripoli presented growing complications. Amin's presence became an international embarrassment and a diplomatic liability for Libya, as neighboring African states and the new provisional government in Kampala steadily pressured international actors to deny him a permanent platform. Gaddafi's government, realizing that the deposed dictator could no longer serve any strategic purpose, and sensing the mounting regional friction, quietly encouraged Amin to look elsewhere for a permanent home. After months of uncertainty and moving between temporary locations, Amin found a permanent haven in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family agreed to grant him political asylum under strict conditions that would govern the remainder of his life. The primary and absolute condition imposed upon the former dictator was that he must remain entirely apolitical. Saudi authorities made it crystal clear that Amin was forbidden from engaging in any political activities, issuing public statements, granting interviews to international journalists, or attempting to organize any form of opposition or military counteroffensive against the new leadership in Uganda. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in public spectacle, grandiose speeches, and the exercise of raw power, this enforced silence was a profound and constant restriction. In exchange for his cooperation and silence, the Saudi government provided Amin and his immediate family with a comfortable, secure residence in the port city of Jeddah. They were given a spacious villa overlooking the Red Sea, financial stipends to maintain a comfortable standard of living, and protection from any potential extradition requests or assassination attempts by his numerous enemies. Surrounded by family members who had accompanied him into exile, Amin settled into a remarkably quiet, domestic routine that stood in stark contrast to his turbulent years in power. He spent his days swimming in the warm waters of the Red Sea, playing his favorite musical instrument, the accordion, driving around Jeddah in luxury automobiles provided for him, and spending time with his children, many of whom were enrolled in local schools. Despite the luxurious setting and material comforts, Amin's life in exile was marked by deep isolation and occasional flashes of erratic behavior. Cut off from the levers of state power and forbidden from addressing the world stage, he occasionally attempted to break his silence, leading to swift reprimands from his Saudi hosts. On one notable occasion in the early 1980s, Amin contacted a foreign news agency and expressed a desire to return to Uganda to restore order, claiming that the country was suffering under his successors. The reaction from Riyadh was immediate and uncompromising. Saudi authorities placed him under tighter surveillance, restricted his communications even further, and reminded him that any violation of his asylum agreement would result in immediate expulsion. Chastened by the warning, Amin retreated back into his secluded lifestyle, realizing that Saudi Arabia was his only remaining refuge. Back in Uganda, the name Idi Amin remained a heavy shadow, but the man himself slowly faded into a historical footnote, becoming a distant figure of curiosity and revulsion. International journalists occasionally tracked down rumors of his whereabouts, leading to rare, clandestine photographs or brief published reports showing an aging, heavy-set former dictator living a life of quiet luxury, while millions of his former subjects continued to grapple with the long-term devastation he had caused. Stories circulated about his daily habits in Jeddah, how he frequented local supermarkets, enjoyed swimming, and occasionally startled shopkeepers who recognized the notorious face behind the casual civilian clothes. Yet, these glimpses only served to highlight the surreal disconnect between his terrifying past as a brutal autocrat and his mundane, sheltered existence as a pensioner in a foreign land. As the decades progressed, Amin's health began to decline steadily. The physical vigor that had once defined his early military career and athletic pursuits gave way to the ailments of old age. He developed hypertension, kidney complications, and other chronic health issues that required frequent medical attention. During the final years of his life, he spent extended periods hospitalized in Jeddah under the care of specialized physicians, largely confined to his rooms and increasingly detached from the changing world outside. Even as political landscapes shifted across Africa and the turn of the millennium brought new generations into power, Amin remained a forgotten relic of a darker era, quietly aging away thousands of miles from the fertile hills and troubled streets of the nation he had once torn apart. The long exile in Jeddah finally came to a close in the summer of 2003, when Idi Amin's failing health reached a critical stage. Admitted to the King Faisal Specialist Hospital in Saudi Arabia due to severe kidney failure and multiple organ complications, the former dictator slipped into a deep coma from which he would never recover. On August 16, 2003, at the age of approximately 78, Idi Amin passed away in a foreign hospital bed, thousands of miles away from the soil of the nation he had ruled and ravaged. His death brought a quiet end to a life defined by extraordinary violence, unchecked ambition, and profound contradiction. Yet, while the man himself was gone, the heavy shadow he cast over Uganda remained completely intact, etched deeply into the national consciousness and the collective memory of a traumatized country. To understand the true legacy of Idi Amin, one must look beyond the bizarre anecdotes, the eccentric titles, and the theatrical media appearances that often dominated Western reporting during his years in power. Beneath the facade of the jolly, accordion-playing general lay a cold and systematic apparatus of state terror. Historians and human rights organizations estimate that between 100,000 and 500,000 Ugandans lost their lives during his 8-year presidency. This staggering death toll did not result from a single conventional war or a natural disaster. Rather, it was the calculated product of political purges, ethnic targeting, arbitrary arrests, and extrajudicial executions carried out by military intelligence units and the notorious State Research Bureau. Entire communities, rival political factions, religious leaders, intellectuals, journalists, and ordinary citizens suspected of disloyalty were systematically hunted down. Families across Uganda were left with an agonizing void, searching for answers about loved ones who had simply vanished into the night, never to be seen again. The economic devastation left in the wake of Amin's regime was equally catastrophic. Before the 1971 coup, Uganda had possessed one of the most promising and vibrant economies in East Africa, buoyed by robust agricultural exports, a thriving commercial sector, and a strong currency. Amin's impulsive and catastrophic decision to expel the Asian business community in 1972, followed by his chaotic program of economic nationalization, known as the Economic War, shattered the nation's financial foundations. Experienced merchants, industrialists, and agricultural experts were driven out overnight, and their properties and businesses were handed over to loyalist military officers and untrained individuals based entirely on political favoritism. The predictable result was widespread mismanagement, severe shortages of basic consumer goods, rampant inflation, the collapse of foreign trade, and the total paralysis of public infrastructure. A nation that had once fed its own people and exported surplus food found itself facing acute scarcity, empty store shelves, and a ruined currency. Furthermore, Amin's rule deeply fractured Uganda along ethnic lines, leaving a legacy of division that took generations to heal. British colonial administration had long utilized divide-and-rule tactics, favoring certain regions and ethnic groups over others within the military and civil service. Amin amplified these historical grievances to a toxic extreme, systematically purging military officers and public servants from northern and eastern ethnic groups, such as the Acholi and Lango, while elevating soldiers primarily from his own West Nile region, particularly members of the Kakwa and Nubian communities. This deliberate polarization turned the armed forces into an instrument of ethnic oppression and sowed deep-seated fears and hostilities among different groups across the country. The civil wars and political instability that plagued Uganda in the years immediately following his overthrow were direct consequences of the deep fractures he had intentionally widened. When news of Amin's death reached Uganda in 2003, the public reaction was complex, varied, and largely muted. There was no nationwide mourning, nor was there widespread celebration of vengeance. Instead, the country responded with a somber reflection on a painful past. Some families of victims expressed frustration that Amin had escaped formal international prosecution, living out his final decades in comfortable exile while they had been left to bear the lifelong burden of grief and loss. Others felt a sense of closure, viewing his passing as the final, definitive punctuation mark on a nightmare era that the nation was collectively trying to leave behind. President Yoweri Museveni, whose National Resistance Army had come to power years after Amin's fall, stated that while Amin's remains could be buried wherever his family chose, and the Saudi government ultimately buried him quietly in a Jeddah cemetery. His return to Uganda was neither necessary nor appropriate. In the decades following his death, Uganda underwent a long and difficult process of national reconstruction, economic recovery, and political transition. Monuments were not built to honor his presidency, and schools taught the history of his regime as a stark warning about the fragility of democracy and the devastating cost of unchecked tyranny. Memorial sites, documentation projects, and human rights archives were established to preserve the testimonies of survivors and ensure that the victims of the State Research Bureau and military purges were never forgotten. For younger generations of Ugandans born long after 1979, Amin became a historical figure studied in textbooks, a cautionary tale of how a nation with boundless potential can be brought to its knees by fear, bigotry, and brute force. Ultimately, the legacy of Idi Amin is not merely a chronicle of one man's descent into megalomania, but a testament to the resilience of the Ugandan people. Despite the profound devastation of the 1970s, the country managed to rebuild its institutions, restore its economy, and foster a spirit of unity that rejected ethnic polarization. Amin's Uganda stands in history as a stark reminder of the horrors that occur when power is concentrated entirely in the hands of an unchecked autocrat. Yet, the story of modern Uganda is equally defined by its refusal to let that darkness define its future, proving that human dignity and the desire for freedom